Can you explain why dev teams should have such a short, feedback loop and how it helps engineering organizations continuously improve?
Yeah, it's like the cornerstone that great engineering teams are built on. If you have that rapid feedback loop, then you're able, you have that original intent. It's fresh in your head. You know exactly what you're trying to do and why, and all the trade-offs you had to make, and all the variable names, and everything. And you can never get that back again. It starts to decay immediately as soon as you've switched your focus away from it. Um, there's that reason. There's also the fact that if you elongate that from 15 minutes to say hours or whatever, you're going to start batching up lots of people's changes and sending them all out together, which means you've severed the ownership cycle there. If your code is going out within 15 minutes or less, you're going to go look at it. If you know that your code and half a dozen to a dozen others might go out at some point in the next hour, day, or week, you're not going to go look at it, right? Like it just, and the longer it gets, the more this stuff snowballs, right? The longer the interval, the more time you spend waiting on people, the bigger the diffs get, the longer it takes to review them, the more coordination it takes, the more, now you're going to need like specialists to do your build and deploys, because every time a deploy fails, you have to just start doing git bisect to try and figure out whose fault it was. Then it ruins the rest of everyone's day who happened to ship something in that release, and now before you know it, you're a giant org that moves like a dinosaur. Like you can spend your life fighting all of the pathologies and the side effects and everything, or you can fix it at the source, 15 minutes or bust.
Yeah, long feedback cycles ruin people's days. That's my takeaway from that. And yeah,
let's not get too no, fuck it. Let's get very emotional about this. It ruins lives, ruins careers. It makes software engineering incompatible with, say, adulthood and parenthood. Engineering should be a creative, fulfilling activity. If you're on a high-performing team, you spend most of your time solving new and interesting puzzles that move the business forward every day. The longer that feedback loop is, the more you can't live up to that, and it just becomes a bunch of toil.
Well, definitely hard to disagree with that. So totally, for sure. Dana, do you know how long it takes someone at GitHub to release to production or anything around feedback loops?
I mean, I dream of the 15-minute cycle, if that tells you anything. The reality of it is we have huge major scale, and we are a polyglot environment, and there's some release paths that are like 15 minutes. You're like, yes, new hot stuff. I can get it in. I can see it. I can do it. The reality is we have a monolith still at GitHub for a good chunk of our code base. And so we have to do smart things to ensure that we get that 15-minute loop. So we're deploying continuously. We have continuous integration, as you can imagine. Depending on the different type of product that you're working on or where it splinters out, we have a huge ecosystem with different cloud providers. We also have our on-prem. It's a mismatch, as you can imagine, with this type of scale and tech we started. So we're always looking at those paid paths, though. And so we try to put that down to the team, the engineering team. So some teams, because of the way that they have been, I don't want to say stuck, but yeah, they're kind of stuck. I'll use charity. They're kind of stuck having to write and deliver code on some of the pipelines. It's a slower cycle. So we've gotten smart about it. And so we have a size limit and we batch them up in what we call trains, deployment trains. Because you got to do it. And no, it's like the battle that I feel never end. I'm like, fuck trains. And I'm like, oh, you got to have fucking trains. And I'm like, no trains. But you have to find what works for your systems and continuously improve it. You continuously deploy.
You got to meet people where they're at.
You got to meet people where they're at. You got to observe and and look back and say, okay, what friction is really happening there? And then also assess the risk of change, right? We have a whole system because we have to have some of these ways that we deploy within their trains where, it does keep people up at night. So we have to limit the risk. It's like how many lines of code, how many changes, who's watching it? Are we following the sign? Is the train conductor, healthy, able, and ready? Do they understand the changes? Are you writing good documentation? Because when you have a system where it's still a little brittle in some areas, you got to go find those points. So we're always deploying. We're always deploying. I took a peek and I was just like, oh my gosh, we've already deployed to production over 600 times and it's 1:48 Pacific today. And so I was like, it's always just jamming through. But we're not hardcore. We want to, people go and they look at metrics and they're just like, okay, time to commit and cycle time. We all want it to be the standard box and bow. I'm like, when you get to a certain scale, like reality comes and sets in, you know, and you still should have, you know, goals that meet and satisfy really the friction, right? It's all about the developer experience at the end of the day. How are you making their lives better? And so they don't have to bird dog production because they're like, oh shit, my code is going in 5 hours. Like they have people have life. So long way of saying it varies. It varies.
Yeah, every team is different, and you know, meeting each team where they're at, that totally makes sense to me.